Anyway, I say one of the reasons why they don't become democratic is because they remember the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson promised a fair administration where you judge everybody on basis. Essentially, it sounds like Martin Luther King. I'll judge everybody on the content of their character. I'm a PhD. I'm the president of Princeton. I'm the progressive governor of New Jersey. W.B. Du Bois was sucked in like you wouldn't believe, because let's face it, Du Bois was looking for a way to distinguish himself, and Booker T. Washington seemed to have all the Republican Party in his pocket. Without question, he was the most racist president of the United States of the 20th century. So blacks remember that. Blacks remember the 1928 Democratic Convention in Texas, where black delegates to the Democratic Convention were segregated from white delegates to the Democratic Convention by barbed wire. No, by chicken wire. Physically segregated. So they didn't have a lot of love for the Democratic Party nationally, and so Roosevelt had a selling job for some communities like Chicago. Now, you asked about Ida B. Wells, and it's a very important point, because what you see here with the defeat of Ida B. Wells, and she ran for a state senate seat, I believe in 1930, and she came in third out of three candidates, but she came in the bottom. And why couldn't she translate her extraordinary contribution? Because it's my argument that Ida B. Wells is the most important black Chicagoan, male or female, 19th or 20th century. Why couldn't she translate this into political power? And the answer is very simple. Because politics was a profession. And she was a civic leader. And politics had moved from the John Jones tradition to a tradition of professional politics in which civic leaders were, in which one of the goals was to increasingly marginalize civic leadership. When Oscar DePriest was first elected to the city council, the first ordinance he introduced was a civil rights ordinance, which of course was defeated. So it is not as if the politicians, the professional politicians, ignore civil rights. It is rather that its practical application, when there are political costs to be borne, you have to kind of move away from it. Which brings me then to the transition of blacks to the Democratic Party, because it's a perfect example of that. William Levi Dawson is one of the most important and interesting people in black history. He's a Phi Beta Kappa from Fisk, who fights in World War I and uses the experiences of World War I to organize blacks. He's a very eloquent speaker, which is surprising because most people always think of him as being inarticulate. He loses a leg, not in the war, he loses a leg falling off an L platform, seeing a politician off. So he always has a wooden leg. In 1928, he runs against Martin Madden on the militant premise that since it's a majority black congressional district, it needs a black representative. 1930s, early 1930s, he and William King are the chief political lieutenants of Oscar DePriest. William Levi Dawson is a Republican. But in the middle 1930s, even after he runs for Congress himself as a Republican, he is critically aware, because he also owns real estate on the South Side, that black people are impoverished. You got to remember that in the early days of the Depression, the early 1930s, you had several thousand evictions of black people a year. And you began to have a black response to this. You go to Washington Park, and the police would show up. No, actually the county sheriff would show up, 3 officers, and they take all the furniture out of the woman's apartment and put them on the street. And they'd leave. And young black men would grab the furniture and carry it back to the woman's apartment. Well, they were already there anyway, because lots of them were sleeping in Washington Park. I was talking to one guy who's talking about how he developed the skill of keeping one leg moving while sleeping. He would go into a lobby of a hotel, and basically he had kind of an agreement with the bellman that as long as he kept that leg moving, the guy wouldn't bother him. He told me depression was harder than Japanese arithmetic. Now, what this means is that there's going to be a confrontation, and the confrontation occurred. 3 black men were trying to move some furniture in. The cops apparently came back. They got into a scuffle. They fired into the crowd, killed three men. And so Washington Park was lit so brightly that you probably could see them all the way downtown as they were marching to the funeral. Tens of thousands of people marching to the funeral of these 3 black people, and of course, the evictions ended. So what was happening is a class conflict was emerging. Oscar DePriest was on the wrong side of these issues because he was railing against communism and railing against welfare programs. And so a guy named Arthur W. Mitchell comes in. And Arthur W. Mitchell is one of my least favorite politicians, and I'll admit it. Militant on the issue of race, but conservative on economics, DePriest. Liberal on the issue of economics, but as conservative an Uncle Tom as you'll ever see was Mitchell. When the cafeteria refused to serve black employees in Washington, D.C., White House cafeteria, Oscar DePriest sent his secretary, who just happened to be the secretary for the local Chicago branch of the NAACP, down to the cafeteria and said, I want you to get some food, whether you're hungry or not. Mitchell apparently thought the best way to get things for black Chicago was to downplay civil rights issues, anti-lynching issues, and cozy up to white Democrats. And anyway, he only held office, not because there was a coterie of powerful, influential, and aggressive blacks, as there was in the Republican Party in Chicago in 1930, but because he had the support of powerful, influential whites. So that the black Democratic Party that emerged from the very beginning was weaker in terms of black loyalty and leadership than was the Republican Party, which means that there's going to be an insurgency. In 1939, a man named Earl Dickerson is elected the first Democratic alderman. He defeats a man named William L. Dawson. And Dickerson is a new breed. Dickerson is, and I had the good pleasure of, Dickerson is very bright and he knows it, and he shows it. He makes money independent of politics, legal money that is. He's always head of the Urban League or the NAACP, so he has a civic background. And it's very clear that he's going to be a threat to Arthur Mitchell from the moment of his election. Now, the mayor of Chicago by 1939 is a man named Robert Kelly. And Kelly is part of what's known as the Kelly-Nash machine. And they are the successors to Anton Chermak. Anton Chermak may have created the machine, but the Kelly-Nash machine, which of course returned leadership of the Democratic Party in Chicago to the Irish, the Kelly-Nash machine is, they perfect the multi-ethnic political machine that the Democratic Party was known for in the 1940s and 50s. But Kelly had, for some reason, maybe because he's from the South Side, he had an interest in bringing blacks into the Democratic Party, not through threats and intimidation, but through rewards. He identified William L. Dawson as a Republican I'd like to work with if I could ever make him a Democrat. And he saw Earl Dickerson as a threat because Dickerson couldn't be controlled, because Dickerson was active at meetings of the Board of Education, which no black alderman had ever attended, because Dickerson was active in organizing the community about a series of fires which occurred in late 1939 and 1940 in the black community, because it's pointing to slum landlords. Dickerson pushed through or campaigned for an amendment to the traction ordinance to guarantee the employment of African Americans and traction means simply, the L and public transportation. And he was also threatening the possibility of working with organized labor. Without question, Dickerson, who actually supported Wallace, Henry Wallace in 1948, he didn't support Harry Truman, was too far left for Chicago Democratic politics. And so Dickerson made a fatal error, and the error was to agree with William Dawson on a kind of dual leadership. Dickerson was never a nuts and bolts guy. He was a bit of a snob. And so he'd be the alderman. But he would help Dawson become ward committeeman, and Dawson would do the dirty work. Dawson would, help organize the workers, and Dawson would help parcel out the. If you want to be stupid, that's the one thing you do. Why don't I get all the glory and give all the speeches, and why don't you control people and money? Well, as you might imagine, by 1942, Mitchell saw the handwriting on the wall and said, I better retire and go back south, where he created a office which was a perfect replica. Every single point was perfect replica of his office in Washington, D.C. And it was Dawson versus Dickerson. Dawson beat him, so he beat him like a runaway slave. Beat him like he stole something. And to add insult to injury, the next year when it came time for Dickerson to run for re-election as alderman, Dawson ran his secretary, who had only been in Chicago a couple of years and was a fireman. And he beat Dickerson. And so politics changed. The possibility of an independent intellectual insurgency, which might be linked to social movements, was ended. And politics of ends I will, for example, give you a left shoe. And then I'll tell you that if you elect me, I'll come back around and give you the right shoe. Or I'll work with the post office to find out what happened to your welfare check that didn't arrive somehow mysteriously a couple of days before it was time for you to vote in the primary. I find ways either to reward or punish my enemies. I'm not concerned with the turnout of the black community. I'm concerned with being able to control the margin of victory. And so what happens is in the 1940s, very slowly, William Dawson begins to build power as the black population of Chicago increases. Remember, by 1940, Chicagoans are about 25% of the population of the city. And what this means is that former white leaders of areas in transition either will call in Dawson to support them, and he's so happy to speak in their behalf, and to lend them a couple of workers, and then ultimately, before they know it, they've got a judgeship somewhere, and the new state representative and the new alderman are African Americans who are beholding to William Dawson. And so by the 1950s, he's got about 20 major office holders who are absolutely dependent upon him, including, I think, about 4 aldermen. And he is, by the 1950s, the second most powerful Democratic politician in the city. Well, that poses a problem. One is, he may have a lot of political power, but he has scant financial resources. One of the few resources he has, because he lost policy, because Sam Momo Giancana or Sam Mooney Giancana took over policy in the black community once one of the Jones boys was serving prison time and told him while they were in prison, because basically Sam Momo Giancana was actually serving as his protector in prison, how lucrative policy was. So they were shooting up or running out of town the black policy lords, which was the biggest industry in the black community in the 1940s. So by the late 1950s, they've lost a major industry. And what have they got? Well, one of the things they've got are gypsy cabs. And gypsy cabs are illegal. And the Democratic mayor, Martin Kennelly, who is elected in part as a replacement to Kelly, because Kelly is perceived of as too friendly to blacks, Martin Kennelly enforces control over these gypsy cabs and over policy. Dawson comes to him and says, look, these people are just trying to make a living. These are stupid laws. There is no distinction between policy as practiced in the black community in the 1940s and lottery as practiced today. It's the same thing, except that it's probably easier to win a little money on policy in the 1940s. So what happens is he basically says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to help you. And so Dawson learns the lesson that he'd learned from Ed Wright. He doesn't confront Kennelly publicly, but he takes 4 years to help develop the leadership of a man named Richard J. Daley. Now, what happens when Daley comes into office is he knows that his election was orchestrated, at least in part, by a black congressman. He knows that, at least in the first couple of elections, his margin of victory will come from the black community. So he's never going to challenge Dawson, but he is going to orchestrate the development of alternative sources of black leadership. One of the most important alternative sources of black leadership is going to be the Catholic Church. You're going to have a number of politicians who come through the Catholic Church, and then in the 1960s with the war on poverty, they'll come through the bureaucracy. Irvin Francis' example of that he can then run for elective office because they are both middle class and are skilled, and their primary loyalty is not to William Dawson or to black aldermen, but rather to Mayor Daley. So he's creating an alternative chain of loyalty. This would have worked perfectly except for one thing: civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And what happens, of course, is not merely the series of protests over the failure to provide adequate public schooling in the mid-1960s, in which essentially on one day, like over 100,000 black school children don't go to school. And if there's any issue that is of importance to middle-class black parents, it is schooling. But you also have civil rights veterans going to the South and coming back to Chicago. And then don't forget, a couple of years later, Martin Luther King will come to Chicago, and you will not believe what black aldermen said in the city council about Martin Luther King, the outside agitator, at the behest of Mayor Daley. So while he is developing and really offering jobs and careers, especially to college-educated blacks through the bureaucracy, a lot of which is funded by the federal government and federal programs, at the same time, he's got a new challenge to his leadership, and this, of course, will be one of the origins of the Black independent movement. It'll have its origins in blacks like Harold Washington, who came through Roosevelt University, who were influenced by their association with whites and white radicals. It'll have its origins in blacks who came through the civil rights movement, and it'll also have its origins in integrated associations with independent movements that are developing in Rogers Park and in Hyde Park specifically. And what happens is you'll have a series of elections through the 70s and 80s in which blacks will lose. Sometimes they'll lose very big. But what is also important is once in a while they win. One of the best elections occurs when Ralph Metcalfe, who was a machine politician, faces Erwin France, who is a director of a major program for Mayor Daley, which provides employment for literally tens of thousands of blacks. And he's also very active in fraternities, and he's young. And you were sure that Erwin France would win. Metcalfe had raised the ire of Mayor Daley by having hearings as a congressman on the issue of police brutality. Now, Metcalfe cares about police brutality, not because black people are being beaten up about the head or arms, but because a couple of people who were major contributors to his campaign, a couple of people driving Cadillacs, are being beaten up.
Dr. Oldham.
So anyway, he trots out Erwin France. Metcalfe beats him, and this is considered one of those triumphs. But Metcalfe won't break, and so one of his chief lieutenants is willing to break. That chief lieutenant is named Harold Washington. He runs for mayor in 1977, and that's the beginning of a whole different story, and I'll stop now.
Thank you.
Wow.
I would allow questions, but we can't. So this is why, because we need to get set up for an interview. And I would tell, if anyone wants to take, except Carrie, if anyone wants to take a walk around the block, because we're going to be here, and we're going to go straight through the interview. So, you know, unless you want a question or two, but I'm just saying we need to move things along.
How about a question related to
Okay.
the interview?
Okay.
Okay.
No, not to the interview.
Well, just,
Yeah.
yeah, well, research in preparation
No.
for the
Oh, you
interview.
Oh, I see. Do you have any? Do you have his birth?
I gotta run downstairs, or could somebody put money in my meter?
Yeah.
I'm gonna get a ticket.
Do you have his birth and that type of information?
I'll be right back.
his birth, but we have some background information on him.